had a chance really to read her bio that we've had, but she's kind of a rock star in the world of fair housing. I've tried to highlight a few things to talk about here, but I really could just read through the whole thing and it would all be pertinent. I'm not going to.
We don't have time.
But I will get some of the highlights. Again, she is with Relman, Danny Colfax in the area of fair housing and civil rights, especially with lending and civil rights compliance. Before that, she was with HUD as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Enforcement and Programs and Senior Advisor to Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. I mean, that's a lot of words. As part of that, she oversaw the enforcement of things like Section 3, Section 504, Fair Housing Act, Title 6, so on and so forth. She's also been an integral part in the development and implementation of many national plans and policies surrounding fair housing and equal employment. She's also even been a subject matter expert on fair housing, the Fair Housing Accessibility Project, and has even been an expert witness with the Westchester County case. So I think she qualifies as knowing all things fair housing related. So, Sarah, let's go ahead.
Hi, y'all. So I retired from HUD and found that retirement so exhausting, I went back to work. It lasted 6 weeks. So I retired from HUD in November, sold my house, moved into a cool urban apartment in D.C., started my new job with this law firm. And I'm loving all of it, I have to say. So many of you met me as a consultant around the country. I did private consulting, lots of training over the years. I cut my teeth on civil rights at the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights long before Beverly Watts was there, right? I was working on housing desegregation, public housing desegregation, about 1978 or 79 when we won a big case in Kentucky against Middlesborough Housing Authority for maintaining segregated public housing. And then my job was to take that win in the Kentucky Court of Appeals around all the public housing authorities and convince them to change their admission policies to stop the segregation. And we also handled complaints against housing authorities because if the properties were segregated by race, white here, black here, and the black units were always, the black community had grown up around them, or they'd put those units in the black community. And I just want to tell you that we got all these complaints that said maintenance of the properties differed by what the racial composition of the sites. And so that the ones in the black neighborhoods were less well maintained than the ones in the white neighborhoods, and that probably shouldn't surprise you. So I was doing that work when I was 5 or 6. And just to tell you one more little story, I told Tracy I'd been reading a set of essays by a woman named Lee Smith, who writes about the area of southwestern Virginia around Grundy, Abingdon, Lebanon, up in there. That's where my mama's family was from. And as I was reading on the plane on the way down, I picked up an accent again. And I was remembering and wanted to tell you stories about, the whole issue and the importance of paying attention to segregation. And I'm going to call it for what it is, okay? So I'm going to tell you, I grew up as a white girl in Lynchburg, Virginia. You should already know what that tells you about something or another, right? And so I first learned about segregation because I could not figure out these adorable kids that I wanted to play with, their clothes were better than mine, I'm just going to tell you, and their mama seemed to treat them about the same way my mama treated me. The only difference were we had different skin colors. And I could not figure out why they all lived either on the other side of the James River or around downtown Lynchburg, and I lived way out and wherever. And I couldn't figure, and so first thing I learned was that segregation and differences in races was about structure, about where people lived and how we were treated. So as a white girl, I rode the bus, the public bus, to kindergarten, and I never could figure out why that older African-American woman was standing up and giving me her seat, a little 5-year-old kid. who had strong legs that had run to the bus stop because I was late. And I learned that it was about differences in treatment and differences in access to things. Later on, I learned it was more than structural. I learned that it was institutional because I didn't go to school with black people because there were none in the white schools at that time. I learned it was institutional because I learned that there are also no black people in churches. So on Youth Sunday, I gave a homily to my all-white church about where the blacks were and why they weren't in our church too. I learned something from that experience too. All right? I mean, oh my goodness. So I won't tell you all the stories, but I learned about segregation, discrimination, institutional and structural racism as a child and as a white child in the South. And I listened to the very powerful presentations from Emily and Lewis this morning, and I'm like, what more evidence do we need about that social engineering created segregation in this country? Do we need any more evidence? We had the Federal Home Loan Bank, we had the FHA, we had racially restrictive covenants, we had sundown towns, which wasn't mentioned this morning, but James Lowen has written a book and has a website called, if you Google sundown towns, you'll find it, and it has the story of all these communities across the country and not just in the South that say there were some towns, many towns in this country where blacks were not allowed to live. They could come into town to work or to shop, but they were not allowed in those towns after sundown, okay? And all kinds of places from Pasadena, California, yes, to Beaumont, Texas, where I spent a lot of time, Vidor, Texas, where I also spent way too much time, I'm going to tell you the truth, and lots of other places across Tennessee and otherwise. So we constructed this country over many, many years, starting with the institution of slavery and really intensifying in a very organized and structural way, starting maybe 1900, 1910 in this country, to create building blocks by law and by practice eventually as well that deeply segregated our country. Now, so I have been working in civil rights for a long time, and this is my third go-round, over time, to really feel like we got the wind behind our wings and we can make a difference on segregation. The first time was in the late 70s, when the Fair Housing Act had been adopted in 1968, but we were really starting to get into it. I was working at the State Human Rights Commission. I was desegregating public housing. I thought I was something else, right? But I look around, and we were working on desegregation in Louisville too, connection with school desegregation. And I thought, we got this covered, man. Boy, was I young, right? We had another round of interest in segregation issues and what to do about it in the early 1990s, sort of around the publication of a book called American Apartheid by Massey and Denton that really drew America's attention again to the problems of deep segregation in our country and all the things that go with them. And we're now in another time where that has come to attention again. But for the first time ever, we have a structure, and a reasonably strong one at that, a series of structures, truthfully, to take on segregation, to create integration, to create and rebuild our communities that have been so deeply divided, and I say so damaged by patterns of segregation and disinvestment over the years. We have, finally, an opportunity. By the way, I'm not Michael Allen. Michael wished he could be here, but something happened late yesterday at the office that created a problem. We worked together in the same law firm, and I was available to come, so I came. He wishes he were here. I wish he were here. No, I'm just kidding about that part. But the point is, so when we talk about racial segregation, one of the things that you heard this morning is that racial and economic segregation go together. And often we see the layering of racial practices, racially discriminatory practices, with economic disinvestment resulting from many, many, many years of segregation and differentiation and discrimination going hand in hand. So it's an obvious point. We need more affordable housing. Okay, nobody in this room is going to argue with me about that. We need all forms of affordable housing, from home ownership opportunities to rental practices to affordable housing in rural communities as well. We need all kinds of ranges of affordable housing, and Congress ain't giving us the money. You saw that chart with all the little numbers under the line, right? So we got not enough money. So that also requires not just guts and taking it on and identifying your issues. It also requires creativity to figure out what we can do and how we can address it. But race is still stronger than economics. Even relatively affluent African Americans, people who have made it up and made it comfortably into the world in terms of their jobs, their opportunities, their incomes, still tend to live in segregation, and they still tend to live in poorer neighborhoods than their peers. And honestly, they also tend to encounter discrimination still in every kind of way you can imagine. Come to Washington, D.C., and try to catch a cab. Okay? I mean, so we still have a country that is deeply divided. It's not just about class. It's not just about how much you make. It is still and all a very strongly constructed set of walls to keep people in their place, to divide us, and not constructed necessarily by us, and certainly not by choice of most people. Okay? Even for those racists and others who choose, to say they're bigoted things or to act in discriminatory fashion, even for those people, I would argue that they, in some way, are still a victim of government policies and practices and wide acceptance of these practices over years. I mean, I've had my share of sitting down and talking to, how should I put this? Okay, I'm just going to say it. White folks who are bigoted as all get out, right? And who offer their bigoted opinions as justification for some act of discrimination that is going on. Oh, yeah, some of them are even, running for office? What? Okay, so, I mean, and no offense to anyone meant by that, but the truth is some people still feel free to talk about constructing walls and calling people, as they say, out of their names. Okay? So we still have that trend in our country. So while we have great tools coming in on one side, we've also got that strain of the anti-no barrier creation, folks, to contend with. So segregation by race and by national origin, and perhaps even by disability as well, puts a target on people's backs. It absolutely does. If you're poor and if you're black in this country, you're more likely to have poor quality housing. And anybody who has read the book Evicted, which is in my bag, where I left it, to read on the plane on the way, finish reading on the way back, will see the stories of African Americans and whites, but mostly African Americans, and the challenges they face in housing, where they're paying 50% or more of their income for housing, sometimes as much as 80% of their income just to have a place to live, and the place they have to live is poor quality. It's a trailer park, right? It's housing where they haven't been able to get a voucher because they're one of the 11,000 people on the voucher waiting list in Davidson County. 11,000, is that the right number? 14? Breaking my heart, girl. 14,000 people on the waiting list for Section 8 vouchers. They can't get a voucher. They're living in poor quality stuff, no code enforcement in many circumstances, and no real opportunity to get out of their housing. Blacks are more likely to live in neighborhoods with failing schools, more likely to be disconnected from employment, either by lack of training or physical location, physical geography, or lack of money to even get out there into the market and start looking for a place and pay for the transportation that would take until you could get your first paycheck. Inadequate transportation, another issue. High crime, in part due to policing practices. Need I say anything more about that? Poor health outcomes. The most research has been done on poor health outcomes, and you can just go down the list. Higher levels of childhood asthma, higher levels of diabetes, higher levels of heart disease. You've heard these stories. When you add them all up, what you've got is poor health outcomes across the board, and lower mortality rates, or higher mortality rates, I guess I should say. And basically, the last round of predatory lending practices absolutely cut into the relative wealth of the African American community for those people who had been able to make it and to buy a house and then to have been taken advantage of in that process. They lost equity in their houses. It was a huge setback for many people of color. Also, racial segregation allows discriminators to be more efficient. You know, they can cut out, they can create opportunities for profits. So maybe there's more opportunities for profits in doing high-end one-bedroom housing in Nashville that are going to rent for, what is it, $1,800 a month? That's profitable now. Now, there's another question as to whether people in Nashville will pay $1,800 a month. But I'm thinking the answer is they will. So, you know, all of these things, the less knowledge, the less opportunity, the fact that your parents never owned a house so you don't have anybody to give you advice when you're buying your first house, all of that stuff contributes to equity stripping, predatory lending. I want to say a word about community opposition to affordable housing because of who's going to live there. That story is a national scandal. It's a national scandal that people continue to come and push their elected officials, and in many cases their appointed officials as well, not to approve housing in areas outside of the traditional neighborhoods for those people. That community opposition and the weak-kneed people who cave into it creates and perpetuates segregation today in many places across the country. Municipal services. So my firm, before I was at that firm, represented an affordable housing developer, and we do represent affordable housing developers who encounter barriers from local appointed and elected officials. So they cannot get zoning approval, they cannot get variances approved, they cannot get assistance with infrastructure to try to develop in a new neighborhood where they need sewer lines extended or public transportation made more available. St. Bernard Parish, which is a fairly well-known example of a parish that dug in its heels to try to allow itself to be left as white. Place it was 93%, 94% white before Katrina struck, and they were determined, so determined to keep out African Americans that there's stories about St. Bernard Parish sending policemen to guard the levees to keep people from escaping flooding of the lower Ninth Ward. But they also created other kinds of less physical barriers. They were going to shoot the people escaping the flood if they dared to step foot in St. Bernard Parish. But in the bigger picture, they set up a zoning scheme, and they denied approvals, permits. They cut off the power to this affordable housing developer called Provident Developers. They were trying to develop affordable housing that everybody needed in St. Bernard Parish. They were getting ready to build a brand new hospital. The affordable housing, most of it was right near the hospital. The interns were going to be able to live there, and it was tax credit. So, you know, they'd have some at market rate, some at affordable. Nobody had decent places to live because Katrina had taken out so much housing. And the St. Bernard Parish opposed over and over again, as creative ways as you could possibly imagine, the efforts to build these affordable housing units in St. Bernard Parish. Luckily for all of us, I will say HUD stepped in, and HUD gets credit for this because the Secretary of HUD, at a meeting that I attended, told the leadership of St. Bernard Parish that they were going to lose the money for the hospital if they did not rescind their discriminatory ordinances. That's not well known, but he did it. Secretary Donovan did it. And Relman, Dane, and Colfax and the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center sued St. Bernard Parish, as did eventually the Department of Justice. And St. Bernard Parish is being remade now as a matter of that. Their zoning is being remade. They have a fair housing office and a well-paid fair housing officer. They have a fair housing counseling program, and all of that affordable housing is fully occupied in St. Bernard Parish today. Now, it took, you know, the whole power, combined power of the federal government, right, and a private fair housing group like Tracy's group, right, to take this issue on. But that just goes to show, one, it may take that kind of power to make it happen, but you're overcoming institutionalized structural racism embedded in every power structure in that community. It may take that work, and it may take that time, and it may take that money, but change is coming. And change is coming pretty rapidly. So I want to say, I've got a long list of things to talk about, of course. But I want to say, as I move into my discussion about HUD's new regulation, which I was privileged to work on, before I move into that discussion, what I want to say is there are other communities that will be encouraged to take those same kinds of steps without being sued. And HUD is going to encourage them and throw resources at them to help them do it, because HUD says under this new rule that will institutionalize the process of affirmatively furthering fair housing, they want everybody to be successful. But they are dead serious about it. So if you sit on your hands, you ignore it. I sat with one lady. Her new assessment under this rule that was adopted in 2015, her new assessment's due in October. She had not read the rule. She didn't know anything about it. And her assessment was due in October, and nobody'd come to her offering her help or anything else. Okay? So my firm is helping grantees get ready for this process, and helping HUD and helping consultants from all over the country to get ready. At the same time, for those people who sit on their hands, want to put their fingers in their ears and go, nah, 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 or call it social engineering, there are people out there, including my firm, who will bring lawsuits against those communities for failing to affirmatively further fair housing. So the Fair Housing Act has this miraculous little thing in here, requires HUD to administer all of its programs relating to housing or urban development in a manner affirmatively to further the policies of the Fair Housing Act, which is essentially to provide fair housing choice and within constitutional limitations throughout the entire country. So that's in the law. That is a law. But, HUD provided guidance on this in the 90s. I would say I was at HUD then, almost overwhelming opposition from HUD. But we had, Clinton was in. They wanted to do something. They filled out this fair housing planning guide, but didn't set up a process to structure it or to enforce it. You want to have something fail in the federal government? Just put out something that says it'd be a really good idea if you did this. And don't enforce it, and don't provide very good guidance, and don't tell them how to do it. That's how you make things fail in the federal government. Come on. So the other piece to this that is important and much more in use now, and I used it at HUD, litigants have used it, and the Department of Justice have done it as well. Anybody that gets money from HUD, Public Housing Authority, State Housing Finance Agency gets money to administer the home program, CDBG program for balance of state. Any entitlement jurisdiction, okay, that gets money from HUD has to tell HUD, promise, pinky swear in writing, that they will, in exchange for getting that money, not discriminate. And it's not discriminate under the Fair Housing Act or Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act or a bunch of other laws, and they have to certify that they will affirmatively further fair housing. That's a promise. That's not, it'd be a good idea if you did this. It's a promise. And Westchester County was the first example handled by my firm that said, we're going to challenge your certification because we've got evidence that you're not complying with these civil rights laws. Now, HUD did this more times than I can count during the last 5 years. It didn't always make the newspaper. But Dubuque, Iowa's Section 8 program got threatened with the loss of their money because they were running residency preferences that had a disparate impact based on race. They gave a preference to people who lived in Dubuque, 93% white. They gave another preference to people who lived in Iowa, which is like 89%. White. And so if you came in with a voucher and you happened to be black coming from Chicago looking for a safer, better place for your kids, you'd never get a unit in Dubuque because you didn't live in Dubuque and you didn't live in Iowa. You'd go way the heck down the list. They'd never get to you. And HUD challenged that and said, you're going to lose your money because this has a disparate impact based on race. Okay? So sometimes it's pants down discrimination. Sometimes it's just you're doing stuff, maybe you haven't even thought about the impact of it. But in this case, they were told and they didn't change their ways. So, you know, bad for them. So we used the challenge to certification in disability cases against a large West Coast city that had built a bazillion units and had failed to comply with the accessibility requirements in Section 504 in the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. And we threatened their funding. Not well known, but we did it. So using that challenge to a certification based on evidence of discrimination is a new quiver in the bow to help, how should I say, speed up compliance with the civil rights requirements under the law, right? Like, you're not going to get your money unless you do this, so fix it, will you? That process and those commitments, by the way, are built in to the new AFFH process. If you've got a finding from Beverly's agency, if you've got a finding of discrimination against you from HUD, if you've got a finding from a judge against you, or from a DOJ is suing you, you've got a civil rights problem which you have to fix in order for HUD to accept your assessment. All right, so part of the obligation under this AFFH obligation that I'm talking about is to prevent the increase of segregation and to, in many cases, I mean, this is long ago case law. Going back 1973, I told you I was working on this stuff in the 70s. This case was like one of the things we talked about, which is when you perpetuate segregation, when you keep the old stuff in place and don't dismantle it, you continue to increase segregation. And one of the more interesting things, you know, we saw the Federal Home Loan Bank map from the 30s, colored in with colored pencil. Those red areas that were the hazard areas almost inevitably are exactly corollary to a map of today of that community that shows where the African Americans live, which goes to show, first of all, no significant change in occupancy between 1930 and 2015, which is really scary, and shows you how long these practices have been institutionalized. But it also shows us where the opportunity lies. And HUD now makes available, as part of this new AFFH process, the kinds of maps that can help bring home to any of you, because any of you can look at these maps. I'll tell you how to do it before I leave here. To look at where segregation looks like in your community, whether it's Nashville, or out in the boonies, or Jackson, or Knoxville. Anybody here from Knoxville? Oh, me. Okay. So the other part of the rule here is that you cannot just not discriminate. That's kind of the rule for a long, long time. Just don't discriminate. You know, and you know, and if you find somebody's discriminating, let's do something kind of about it, like refer them to Tracy or to Beverly or to Carol over there for enforcement. That's not nearly enough. It's not nearly enough under this rule, and it's not nearly enough under HUD's processes. You have to take the programs and use them affirmatively to stop discrimination and stop segregation to the point where the supply of genuinely open housing increases. 1987, y'all, is not new. So your commitment as a grantee from HUD, Public Housing Authority, state agency, entitlement jurisdiction, you have to certify that you'll affirmatively further fair housing, and under the new rule that HUD published last year, that you will take meaningful actions to further goals, and you will take no action that is materially inconsistent with the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And if you do, you will be at jeopardy for losing your money, or at least delaying your money, and either one is not good if you're a grantee. And it applies, the obligation comes to all grantees, whether or not they're using particular federal funds for a particular operation. All housing and housing-related activities, whether they're publicly funded or privately funded, maybe you've got some money from the lottery or from a trust fund that's maybe not federally funded exactly, or some other source, your activities are still subject to the obligation. So HUD's new rule was published, it says July 16th, 2016. It was July 16th, 2015, last July. As I mentioned, I was privileged to be able to work on this rule The HUD has also now published 3 different assessments. I also was privileged to work on one of them, the one having to do with grantees, which was published in December, which is like a template. It's like an outline of all the stuff you have to think about and cogitate on and come up with answers to in order to adopt fair housing goals. And you have to do it. It's not like you can leave it blank. You know how, when you were a kid and you took the test and you left something blank? That didn't help your grade. Doesn't help it on this either. You've got to answer it, and you've got to have good answers, right, to show that you're really thinking about it. So there is a template for jurisdictions, which is entitlement jurisdictions, mostly receiving around $50,000 or more from HUD and the Community Development Grant Program. There is a state template that is published in March, late March, and there's also now a public housing agency template that was published. So for an assessment, you can work together and do either a regional approach or a collegial approach. So I was just in Marin, California on Monday, and I found 3 cities that were kind of adjacent to each other, and they're all going to go in together and do a regional approach. Because, segregation often does not stop at the city line. It crosses city lines, and sometimes unified strategies are necessary to take things on. Public housing agencies can work with their city or their county, or they might work with their state if they're in the balance of the state. There's also a new guidebook to the assessment process. Much better than reading the rule. Don't read the rule. You'll give yourself a massive headache. Okay, if you're going to bring the lawsuit, you can read it. You guys going to sue? Read it. The rest of you, if you really want to know something about the assessment process, read the guidebook because it goes through it kind of in plain language. Do not watch any of the video of the videos that HUD has published for technical assistance unless you really want to be bored to tears, but you can look at it if you want to. Not my job to protect you from boredom. And there's also these maps. So you saw an example of a map in Emily's slideshow. Remember the map of Davidson County? So do you remember how there were these bright pink areas in the middle? There was clustered in the middle, there were like 4 areas that were kind of outlined in fuchsia. Those are the areas, I know you know what I'm going to say, those are the areas where there is concentrated racial segregation and concentrated poverty, both of them together. They're called racially concentrated areas of poverty or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, or for short, RCAP or ECAP. And in Nashville, it's mostly about race. But if you look at the bigger map, the dots will show you other areas which are segregated by race, maybe not as poor in comparison to those areas, but segregated nonetheless. And some areas you will find are notably really, really, really white. White, right? And there are other maps in this system that you can pull up that will show you where the public housing is, every single one of them, all of HUD's multifamily, all of the tax credit properties, right? And you will find that there are huge amounts of overlays between where this housing was put and the patterns of segregation. So were they put there originally because it was a black neighborhood, so they just put them there because people wanted better housing? No argument with that. Or did they put them there because that was the safe place to put them because then they didn't have to fight community opposition someplace else? So one of the things about this whole process is that, is what, I guess Emily really said it this morning, there's a balance. There's a balance. So one thing, a part of it, is to invest in communities of color. And sometimes that it can include replacing old, dilapidated housing, and should. But it also could mean bringing the first grocery store ever to a neighborhood, or the first drugstore ever to a neighborhood, or providing access through transportation, or putting a really proficient school in there, so that that neighborhood, it's not like the old model where the answer by many communities was once again to victimize people of color. The old answer in Hope 6 was, okay, we're going to get some money for some new housing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take down this crappy housing. Everybody's going, yes, this housing is terrible. Except they brought in the bulldozers, tore it all down, and never built enough units to replace the units that were lost. Or they gave people vouchers, and they moved down the street, around the corner, or wherever they could find a place to take their voucher, but it didn't really change their lives. Maybe in some ways made it harder. And by the way, it destroyed their neighborhoods. I'm a big one for neighborhoods. I grew up in the South. I like sitting on the front porch talking to everybody. And I think investment means sustaining those neighborhoods that have hung together all this time, investing in them, but at the same time, at the same time, in a 5-year plan, you've also got some plans to make opportunities available in other areas where better schools are, where there's already investment. I was a single mom of a teenager for a long, way too long. And, I said all moms with teenagers are exactly the same. You want a place where the school is good. You want a place where your kid can walk to the bus, so you don't have to come home and tote them around all the time. You want a place where your kid as a teenager can get an after-school job. You want a place that if they break their ankle playing soccer or street ball or whatever it is, that you can get them to an urgent care center or to a doctor. That's what every parent wants for their kids. And if you could choose, and you do like to have a Target within striking distance, okay? I'm just going to say, right? So that's commercial retail, right? So think about what you'd like, right? What would you like to have? And in some cases, it means bringing those things to people in neighborhoods that are already there, and sometimes it means making affordable housing available in other alternative neighborhoods. HUD says, by the way, that this is your chance to talk, because for the first time ever, a grantee has to have public engagement on this, has to listen, and if they don't take your recommendation or yours, they have to justify why they're not. I love that part of community engagement. I mean, you have to get the word out to everybody. You have to have, they encourage public hearings or, focus groups. But you could write them a letter, and they have to pay attention to your issue. This is the opportunity now for you guys to get together, figure out what the barriers are, where the problems are, where the lack of investment is, right? Where new housing could be provided, and write the letter to Davidson County, to the state of Tennessee, Economic Opportunity. Where is that guy that introduced me? What's the name of your agency again? And will you have the lead authority on the assessment for the state, do you think? You did for the AI.
We're working with THDA.
Okay, well, I do know that because I've done some work for THDA as well. So somehow, one of those two agencies are going to do it. Put it in writing, come to the meetings, come to the hearings, make your points, don't whine, have solutions. Don't whine, have solutions. Come on, I did community organizing myself back in the day. Solutions. Tell me how much time I got, will you? 5 minutes?
Till the 15 minutes.
Well, so I don't know how long for that is because I don't have my... Okay, thank you. All right, so backing up a little bit. What is segregation? HUD's rule says segregation is a condition within your geographic area where there's a high concentration of persons of a particular race, color, religion, sex, familial status, that's parents with kids, national origin, or having a disability. We talk about segregation of people with disabilities, I just want to say. Not just race, not just national origin, but also people with disabilities. A lot of time the housing where people with disabilities are able to find accessible housing are right there in the same neighborhoods where public housing is or tax credit housing is, which also tend to be right closely aligned to patterns of segregation by race. Okay? There are a few exceptions. But we segregate people with disabilities in the same way. And integration, there's a process, this is the rule, where there is not a high concentration. So it's all comparable. If your population is 20% African American across the board, right, segregation might be an area where it's 40% or 50% African American as compared to the population across the community. And an area of racial concentration would even be more segregated. So you could have an area of segregation up here that's kind of in a middle-class neighborhood, and it'll show up by dots. And the areas that are really concentrated by both race and poverty will show up with a fuchsia outline on those maps. So affirmatively furthering fair housing is now redefined. It does not mean do an analysis of impediment that includes a poster contest and a calendar and a sort of a list of things that would be nice to do if you got around to it, and then writing it and talking about it and then putting it on the back shelf and leaving it alone. It means actually affirmatively furthering fair housing doesn't even mean doing the assessment that this rule requires. What it means is taking meaningful actions to accomplish what is needed, taking meaningful actions. So, I could talk all I want to in a plan about what I was going to do. This says you got to act. If you're the grantee, if you're the state, if you're the entitlement jurisdiction, if you're the government and you're getting HUD money, or a public housing agency, you got to do something. And that do something has to significantly address disparities in housing needs. It has to significantly address differences in access to opportunity. So again, bring opportunity to segregated and poor neighborhoods, or bring affordable housing to neighborhoods which already have opportunity, right? All right. So the planning obligations those also are tied to overcome historic patterns of segregation and promote fair housing choice, just what you would expect. In other words, social engineering, now required as a condition of funding, to start to really meaningfully address hundreds of years of social engineering that went the other way. So don't let anybody use that social engineering stuff on you, whether they're talking about AFFH or they're talking about so-called disparate impact analysis. What we are talking about is identifying things that are discriminatory, that create disparities in access, that harm people and communities. So not just individuals that get harmed. Any community is only as strong as its weakest link. And the AFFH process and the new assessment is designed to help communities identify those fair housing weak links and make a plan and set goals to start working towards them. So you got to plan it, and then you have to commit to it as part of the money, right? And then you have to take actions, and then you get to report those actions every year during a 5-year consolidated plan process or 5-year PHA plan process. So here there is a focus. Patterns of integration and segregation, top of the list. So first you look at segregation in your community. And I'll tell you these maps, which, by the way, got a computer? Just go in that little search bar and go AFFHT. No www, no .com, no .gov, AFFHT. 5 letters, remember it. All right, that will get you to maps and tables of data. There's, 17 different maps, 12 different maps and 17 different tables of information that all customized to your local area. For jurisdictions, they're up. The state data is not up yet, but a lot of it you can get by looking at region and going from city to city and looking things at a regional level. You have to look at the racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, and they're called out for special attention because they have special needs, and they are the symbolic and actually the areas that the assessment and the rule call out for attention to. So if you've got them, you can't ignore them in the assessment. If they show up on the map, you got to deal with them, right? Fuchsia. Disparities in access to opportunity, that's, all the public housing and the tax credit housing and all of that is in low opportunity areas where their schools are bad and there's no transportation and there's no grocery store, drugstore, or bank. I forgot to mention banks before. Banks are an important partner in this because either banks are operating in communities of color or they're not. And despite the Community Reinvestment Act and all these sort of good laws that we're supposed to have out there, I can't tell you how many communities do not have a bank in their communities of color. Not a branch bank, not an ATM. And that's easy. So think about African American. Think about your neighborhood. Well, first of all, I'll assume, think about an African American neighborhood. I'll just put it that way. Now, know the rest of the city. Drive around that city. Oh, I'm supposed to go back here. They want me on the camera. Now drive around your city. Drive around your city and look for the banks. All right, the banks, a lot of local banks, some big banks, and see which ones are operating those nice white neighborhoods near the Target and the Walmart and the suburbs and the good schools. Where are they? All right, now take that list and now drive through your African American communities and see which ones you see. You see any? All right, walk in the grocery stores. Just make sure they haven't stuck a branch in the grocery store somewhere. So that is a disparity in access to opportunity, y'all. And HUD has taken on that issue in a narrow format, not in the AFFH, on enforcement against multiple banks in the St. Louis area. Perhaps you've heard about them. There's Midland, American, I can't remember the names of all of them. There were 4 cases against 4 different lenders who had completely abandoned the East St. Louis area, which is mostly black. And HUD took on Associated Bank across the Midwest in 5 communities, and I'm proud to say negotiated the biggest redlining settlement in the history of the world for a huge amount of investment in the communities of color, including commitments to make loans in those neighborhoods and to have special outreach and to put branches in those communities, right? So you can put it on a street corner. Yes, you can put it in a grocery store or drugstore because that's where people put branches these days. But you can look at that in your own community. That's start 1 to disinvestment in communities of color. Public supported housing, that's where your public and assisted housing has been all these years. And where is it located in connection to patterns of segregation? There are a lot of questions there, including one of my personal favorites. Is there disparities between the racial occupancy by site and public housing agencies? So do you have all white sites and all black sites? Remember, how many years did I spend working on that in Kentucky? Thumbs up if you can remember that I spent at least 5 years of my career working on that in Kentucky. Right? So that part of segregation is important to pay attention to, and there are many other questions in this area. The disability and access analysis is a separate analysis that covers all of these things just for disability, because disability is a little different. You need to talk about accessible housing. You need to talk about affordable accessible housing. You need to talk about permanent supportive housing, where that housing is located and who it serves. You need to talk about access to opportunity for people with disabilities. And that might be a little different than the access to opportunity that a family needs. Family might need access to schools, right? And the Walmart and the Target. Well, people with disabilities may not need schools so much. They may need proximity to social services and the Target and the Walmart and the drugstore and all of the rest of it, right? So it's a different analysis, and they pulled it out. And the final thing is fair housing resources. I will say that my argument about fair housing resources, for those of you who are grantees in the room, I believe, Beverly nearly fell out of her chair when I said this, I believe that 3% of the annual budget of a grantee should be devoted to fair housing education and enforcement. And that at the state level, you know, you've got more money to play with, but sometimes smaller communities may contribute to that. But if you've got a city that does not have a fair housing enforcement agency, Knoxville, then you should be thinking hard about reinstituting an enforcement office and putting some budget money into that, because it's going to come up in your assessment. Just saying. I love you, Knoxville. My brother lives in Knoxville. Give him some fair housing rights, all right? So there's a whole series of maps. This is just a few of them. Limited English proficiency populations. These are people who do not read or speak English well. A map that shows where they are in your community. Maybe there are pockets of Somali refugees or Vietnamese people who have settled in the community, or people who have come to your city from Guatemala and Mexico who are Spanish speakers. Right? It shows you where they are and where they live in relationship to patterns of segregation. Often you will find that community segregated itself, but not necessarily consistently located with patterns of race segregation, but nearby often, because that's where the affordable housing is that they need to be able to enter into the community and find a place to live. So as I mentioned earlier, the assessment has a focus on this RECAP thing, which is the fuchsia outlined areas, because the evidence shows that life outcomes, lots of opportunity problems, the problems associated with segregation are even worse when they're attached also to a neighborhood that's both segregated and poor. And because that should draw your attention and your investment dollars to those parts of the community. So the way this works is it's an outline. It's got maps. It's got tables. And it says things like prompts like, and questions like, prompts like in school, right? This is just like those damn worksheets. Anyway, right? So they have maps and tables, and it says, looking at table blah, assess the patterns of segregation. Identify areas where these neighborhoods are segregated and identify the predominant groups. Describe the extent to which R and ECAP tracts are grouped together or scattered. In Nashville, grouped together close in the middle of Davidson County and not out on the edges, okay? For each neighborhood, describe the characteristics that set it apart. Now, some of this is your own knowledge, but I tell you what, if you know your community, you can say, this community is really cool because although it's poor and it's segregated, it's on public transportation, it's near jobs, it's a great opportunity for X or Y or Z. Oh, it's got a lot of family housing. So it's a great place to put in a magnet school with great quality education, and we need some after-school jobs and some entry-level jobs there. And everything else is good. So that's how you would assess your particular neighborhood. In another neighborhood, you might say, this is way out in the country, and it's, it's segregated by race. You can't get anywhere there without a car. I mean, that's how that neighborhood is different, right? So you identify those neighborhoods and make patterns. So Tracy's giving me the stop sign, but I'm not quite ready to stop. You guys okay with me? So this is the stuff you got to think about as creating this or perpetuating it. This is a list of some of them. Land use and zoning laws, has that been a factor? How about your state law that bans inclusionary zoning? Does that contribute to patterns of segregation? Is it a failure to affirmatively further fair housing to pass it again after it's been in effect for a long time? I'm gonna tell you, if I'm HUD, anybody from HUD in the room? Zach! Hi, Zach! Okay, not to put you on the spot or anything, Zach, but if I were HUD, I'd want to know what this ban on inclusionary zoning is all about, what the effect of that has been since the mid-90s on housing segregation, because I'm going to go like, oh, no, can't have that. But more importantly, if you're the state of Tennessee, anybody in the room from the state of Tennessee? Never mind, don't put up your hands. I won't put a target on your back. But I think you're going to have to assess that law. You're absolutely going to have to assess it and see whether it's contributed to patterns of segregation. Here's the other one I want to mention, patterns of community opposition. And really, when we say community opposition, we're not just saying, oh, we don't want any, we don't want apartments in our place. We're saying we don't want those kind of people in this place. There would be burdens on the schools. Bingo, discrimination against families with kids. We don't want those people. It'll be like a ghetto. Code words, y'all. Race, national origin, okay? That community opposition can be expressed and out in the open, or it can be established indirectly by evidence like the whole rules changed as soon as the affordable housing was being proposed for this white neighborhood. And all of a sudden they have public hearings all over the place that they never had before. They've changed the procedure. There's delays. There's extra requirements. There's extra money. There's an effort to get the family units to be turned to senior units because seniors are safer, right? Not in my neighborhood, but that's a different question. All right. So you have to think about all these things and assess them. So there's similar factors to disparities in access to opportunity, lack of private investment, lack of infrastructure. You want to put some stuff out in the boonies, but you don't have public water yet. Okay? You don't have public transportation there yet. I gave a speech once in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where everybody in the room agreed that the single biggest barrier to the placing of affordable housing in a high opportunity area was the need to extend the public bus line by 3 miles. That's all it was. That was the only barrier. Everybody else agreed. So I left them with instructions that I wasn't coming back here until they got the line extended for that 3 miles. I haven't been invited back yet, but I think they're working on it. All right? So you gotta be open. It is not illegal to talk about race. I appeared in my private life in front of a zoning commission in Washington, D.C., and we're talking about preserving affordable housing in a historically black neighborhood while gentrification was occurring. Right? That's even more sophisticated issue, right? But lots of fun to talk about. And the zoning commission guy got on us white people because we were talking about race. Like we weren't allowed to talk about race. And I just wanted to spit in his face. Because, of course, how are you going to address patterns of segregation unless you talk about the need for affordable housing for people of color? Come on. Polite people have to talk about race, and they have to be honest and candid and sketch out directions and think about solutions. Because this is not just we got 1,000 problems. This is about we got to find solutions. So, generally speaking, many opportunities to participate. I'm going to send it you out of here with a commitment. I'm still on the camera. That's good. But here's the commitment. I'm going to deputize all of you. And I'm going to tell you that I challenge each and every one of you to participate in the public participation process in a concrete, meaningful way when the assessment comes up in your neck of the woods, whether it's Davidson County. You got to be there testifying, man, right? You'll be there. But come up with solutions, because the history informs the direction we need to go. And don't settle for long-term answers. I have seen communities turn around with plans that are go forward over 2 to 3 years. Not that everything has to change, but focus your attention on something that is manageable and doable and can be successful. Throw the resources at it and show the change. Because the community, in many cases, need to see that change is being brought forward. We've gone too many years without change. So I challenge you to be the emissaries in your community or at the state level to bring change to your communities using this new process. Thank you so much.